Hello. Nice. Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm going to be talking to you about the struggles of nation building. And I know what some of you guys are thinking, Maria, we already know everything there is to know about the struggles of nation building. We're from America. In the United States, we have American history beat into our brain from the ripe young age of 7th grade. So I bet you're thinking to yourself, Maria, we know everything there is to know about nation building. I hate to break it to you, but unfortunately that is simply not the case. Americans back during the Revolutionary era, just like Americans now, tend to get exactly what they want with very little struggle whatsoever. In the grand scheme of things, Americans did to Britain back then what Americans do to their mothers now. They complain and they whine and then they get what they want. Now, of course, I'm comparing a violent revolutionary war to being grounded for a couple weeks, but you get the point. The fact of the matter is that nation building for Americans simply just wasn't as difficult as it was for other countries. I want to take a look back to China, roughly in the 1800s, to kind of look at how the lack of industrialization in the country at the time kind of affected its reputation as a great power. Now, the earliest known records of civilization in China date all the way back to 1250 BC. And you probably remember in all of your history classes learning about the Shang dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the Ming dynasty, because those are the years when China was kind of stagnant in Asia and there were no huge progressions and there were no big wars and China just kind of stayed to itself. Not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there were thousands of years where there was no major problems in China. But unfortunately, when we reach the 1800s in China, we start to see some problems, particularly with Great Britain and the industrialization in Europe. Now, prior to the industrialization in Europe, China didn't really have any need to industrialize. I mean, they had millions and millions of people, one of the greater populations in the world at the time. So leaders prior to the 1800s said, oh, we don't need to industrialize. We have all the manpower that we need. We don't need big factories or big machinery. And for a while, those leaders were right. But this really starts to change in the beginning of the 1800s because Great Britain comes in and does what British people do best and try to ruin things for everyone. By the beginning of the 1800s to about the 1830s, Europe has begun to see vast improvements in industrialization all across the continent. A lot of historians think that this is because European countries were constantly trying to one-up each other. I mean, Great Britain was scared of Spain, who was scared of France, who was scared of Italy. For European countries, it was all about progress and not security. However, in China at the time, there were really no big competitors. I mean, China was really like the biggest empire in Asia, and they didn't really have many threats. So China was really more concerned about maintaining their own security than they were about competing necessarily with other surrounding countries. Well, this became a problem for China towards the middle of the 1830s, when Great Britain realized that China was its only source of tea. Now, we all know to this day that Brits like their tea. During this time, China seemed to be the only resource in the world that produced massive amounts of tea, and Great Britain wanted it. China gave Great Britain loads of tea in exchange for hard currency like silver and sterling, and for a while that worked. But eventually China realized that they weren't really getting any gain from Great Britain, and that started to kind of make them upset. And China said, hey, we're gonna stop trading you tea unless you can give us something that we want in return. And basically Great Britain panicked. They needed their tea. They were addicted to tea. So the British East India Company scoured high and low for things that they could exchange for tea in China. And then they found opium. Yes, opium, that highly addictive narcotic. So basically India was growing loads and loads of poppy during the time, which is where we find opium. And because the British East India Company had control over India's export, Britain said, here, China, try this. Tell me if you like it. And China said, whoa, where can we get more of that? And for a while that seemed to work out fine. I mean, Great Britain got their tea, China got their opium addiction, and India, I mean, I'm sure they got something. By 1836, China was receiving 36,000 chests of opium every year. And just to put that into perspective, that's 1,200 tons of opium in 1 year. In 1839, the emperor made opium illegal in all of the country and hired Commissioner Lin to figure out what to do with all of this surplus opium that China now had. He dumped chests into the ocean, he burned it, he did whatever he could to get rid of it. He blew up British warehouses of opium in China. And when Great Britain got word of this, they freaked out. So in 1841, Britain grabbed their navy and a little bit of India's navy too and headed over to the eastern coast of China. Because of China's lack of industrialization at the time, China's military really stood no chance to the strong naval forces that Great Britain sent over. I mean, just within a couple weeks, Great Britain was able to seize control over Ningbo, which is a city on the eastern coast of China. China quickly realized there probably was no fighting chance and surrendered, and on August 29th of 1842, China and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Nanking, which China to this day still calls the Unequal Treaty. It officially marks the beginning of the era that China to this day refers refers to as the Century of Humiliation. The treaty basically granted Great Britain control of 5 trading ports on the eastern shore of China. It also guaranteed the secession of the city of Hong Kong to Great Britain and made it a crown colony, basically meaning that the British Queen had control over that as well. It was after the Opium Wars that China really realized that they needed to industrialize in order to protect itself from foreign affairs that could go awry in the future. And I mean, look at it now. China is one of the most industrialized countries in the entire world. And it really shows how history can really change in the matter of just a couple generations. I mean, right now I'm filming this history project in the basement of my house during a global pandemic. And now my friends and I are rewriting history by doing our schoolwork on our beds in our room. I mean, who could have seen that coming? It's a weird world we live in. So I mean, whether you are my history professor watching this a week after I turn it in, or maybe you're just a random subscriber that happens to come across this video, I don't know, maybe you're my kids and I'm showing this to you 20 years from now. Look around and take in the world for a second. I can guarantee you that that's not how it looked 50 years ago. And that is certainly not how it's gonna look 50 years from now. So I don't know, just think about that. Anyway, I hope this was an informative video for you. It was certainly a fun one to make. And I hope that you all are staying safe and healthy and most importantly, sane. Have a lovely day. See you later.